Okay, we might make a start, everyone. I'm sure more and more of you will join us as the minutes roll by. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Lifting the Lid, our free monthly webinar series where we lift the lid on strategic communication excellence. My name is Sia Papageorgiou, and I'm the Director at the Centre for Strategic Communication Excellence. I'm joined today by my colleague, Megan Francis, who is our Marketing and Communication Manager. We're both based in Melbourne, Australia, but wherever you are in the world, we hope you and your loved ones are safe and well. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my first guest, America's crisis guru himself, Jim Lukaszewski, ABC, fellow IABC, fellow APR, fellow PRSA, and PRSA BPS Emeritus. Jim is a powerful speaker, important author, inspiring teacher, and trusted strategic advisor, best known for helping leaders and their organisations prepare for, respond to, and recover from crisis. He's written 14 books, including one of my personal favourites, Why Should the Boss Listen to You? The 7 Disciplines of the Trusted Strategic Advisor. His latest book, The Decency Code, The Leader's Path to Integrity and Trust, was published this year by McGraw-Hill. They don't call him the expert to call when all hell breaks loose for nothing. And today he's here to talk about crisis-proofing your organisation's reputation and maybe your own. But it's hard to talk about crisis without first acknowledging the heaviness in the world right now, and in particular, the racial injustice that is happening in America. Here at the Centre for Strategic Communication Excellence, we stand in solidarity with the Black community, both here in Australia and around the world. Before we begin, I just wanted to let you know that there'll be time at the end of the webinar to ask questions. Now, please use the chat function to ask questions. Megan is moderating the chat, and Jim will read out and answer your questions at the end of his presentation. There's also a handout that Jim has shared with us that Megan has placed into the chat that you can refer to and that Jim refers to throughout his presentation. And on that note, welcome, Jim Lukaszewski.
Thank you so much. It's really delightful to be here and be a guest speaker for the Center for Strategic Communications of Excellence. We got a really interesting program tonight. I usually, in the title of this program, I usually put a parenthetic statement that says, crisis-proofing your organization, and in parentheses, and maybe your career at the same time. Okay, very interesting program. Next slide, please. Let's begin with my definition of crisis, and to some degree a little bit about where I come from on this thing. I've been doing this a long time in many parts of the world, not every part of the world, but many parts of the world, and mostly in the United States, in the North American continent. But this is my definition of crisis that I started with many years ago, and I'll talk about why it's important after we kind of hear it. Right, crises are show-stopping, people-stopping, product-stopping, reputational redefining, trust-busting situations that create victims and or explosive visibility. I know there's lots of definitions in our profession about what this is, but I've said it on this one because we have to focus on the most important aspect of crisis, which is actually ignored in most plans that I see and most public relations activities, and that is the word victims. We're going to talk a lot about victims tonight because the truth is it's victims and the management of victims that really drives your reputation in these circumstances. And as we'll talk about it, you can have a technically perfect response. I work for many organizations that are really very good at this because they have to be. But if you fumble, mumble, and bungle the victim part of this, that's how your wonderful perfect response is always going to be remembered. We'll talk about that. But think about this in terms of this really important aspect called victims. Ironically, not every crisis, there are so many crises in the world, believe it or not, that most of them don't get covered. There's just nobody around to write about it, talk about it, broadcast about it. But as luck would have it, probably yours will be covered. But let's move on from this, and we'll talk a little bit more about what I tend to believe and what I've learned in my life working in crisis for now more than 40 years. Just the next slide, please. Okay. this is a fairly simple statement, but let me tell you what it's based on. What I've learned in my career is some very profound fundamental thinking. The first one is this, that all questionable, inappropriate, unethical, unconscionable, immoral, predatory, improper behavior actually is intentional. An adult somewhere makes a decision to go in a direction he or she knows is not a good one, but they decide to go there anyway. Virtually every aspect of crises that makes it visible is the result, really, actually, of somebody's misbehavior somewhere along the line. Because if you're able to respond to a situation and deal in the way we're going to talk about it tonight, and manage the victim dimension, you're going to be pretty boring as far as the media is concerned. They're interested in people who mess it up. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. I also believe that all ethical behavior, all appropriate, moral, compassionate, decent behavior is also intentional. Adults make the decision to move in directions, I always say, your mother's taught you. We'll get to that mother's in a minute. But these are intentional behaviors. Somewhere along the line, someone chooses either to go in the correct direction or chooses to go in a wrong direction. And if you start thinking about this, especially from an advising standpoint, you begin to look for and search out where the issues sort of went off the rails. But it is something to think about. I've also learned that those who lead with integrity, those who lead with civility and respect, and decency are likely to be more ethical. And more ethical organizations generally handle problems in much better, more problems. We'll talk about that more as we go. Just a couple things. We're going to talk a bit about apology and empathy, and I just want to give you some definitions to think about. Okay, I define apology as the atomic energy of empathy. Something about apology, it's one of the reasons it's so controversial, is that it starts bad things from stopping, and it starts bad things from starting. I define empathy a little differently too, and these, I'm telling you this because it filters its way through what I'm going to talk about later in the broadcast. But I define empathy essentially as positive construction actions, deeds that demonstrate civility, decency, and integrity, while speaking louder than words. Okay, I know that in most cultures, empathy, no matter how you translate it, is sort of like putting yourself on somebody else's shoes. But to tell you the truth, this just never worked for me, and I don't think it's worked for anybody else either. If somebody dies, you can't say to them, "I know how you feel," even if someone died in your family. It's the victim experience is this unique experience that responds to an apologetic process and also especially to empathetic behavior. Now, I know, apology raises the hackles of bosses and attorneys. I mean, they both been educated not to behave this way. But the thing is this: apology, yes, is a legal concept. Yes, there are ramifications for it. Yes, apologizing is making an admission that is legally actionable in almost every culture. But my pitch always is, look, this is a leadership decision. You running this ship, you got this ship in this problem, or you have it in this problem, and if you make this decision to take this extreme step, this atomic step, it's going to be so beneficial to you that it's going to help you so enormously that the sooner you really start thinking about this and escalating your ability to be empathetic, the better things are going to get going forward in the return. I mean, the fact is, you're going to be sued. In most cultures, you're going to be sued. I mean, in America, it costs $35 on a bicycle to get to the courthouse to sue to anybody about anything. So hire more lawyers. Okay, that's fine. But the power of apology, the power of empathy is extraordinary. We'll talk a bit more about that when we move ahead. Why don't we take the next slide, please? Three kinds of victims in this world: people, animals, living systems, a forest, a lake, the air we breathe, somebody's backyard. I think when you think about it, when you think about the news and the coverage of people, of communities, these affecting people, animals, or living systems are really extraordinarily powerful events. I mean, you can burn things down and blow things up, as long as you don't affect adversely animals and people living in the living systems. It's just a bad day for somebody's budget. It is not a crisis. And one of the lessons of this instruction tonight that I want to make sure you take away is that we need to start thinking and talking differently about these situations. And just to briefly capitalize it, crisis management is actually a PR term. And we've used it for decades to kind of like scare the boss to give us some money to figure things out if bad things happen. But after 9/11 in the United States, in the whole process of crisis response and recovery began to respond to something called readiness. And readiness is a management term. Crisis management is not, it's a PR term. So I urge you to think about, as you're listening tonight, starting to focus things within the context of readiness. It's a whole different conversation. You know this yourself. If you've been in business and if you've been in your career for a while and you had to talk about these things, when you start talking about it's a crisis, the first thing management says, well, remember, we can't possibly prepare for everything. Well, that's a bad start to a really important conversation. But if you talk about readiness, then you can say, well, ready for what? And we can actually sort through the things that matter, prioritize them, hypothesize them, think about getting ready for them, which, by the way, management finds are excellent exercises from that standpoint. Readiness, not so much crisis management. And so I want to think about how you characterize yourself. I found over the years, most cultures have this fable about Chicken Little running around, the sky is falling. I've talked about this in all 4 continents, and everybody laughs when thinking about Chicken Little. But quite frankly, communicators are thought about this way by management. We're just running around looking at everything that's got a problem, and it's a crisis, a crisis, a crisis. Settle back in your chairs and think about how you characterize what you're talking about. It's more important than that. And one of the reasons is the only career on the spot in a real crisis is the person who's running the place. They don't fire PR people, they don't fire HR people, they fire the boss. It's just the easiest way to solve problems. So, we'll talk about this, but you have to think about how this is having an impact on the person who's running the place and his or her responsibility going forward. And just to kind of lead this off, as I begin to think about victims, I teach what I call the grand strategy for response. Okay, there's lots of mechanisms people have dreamt up and databases and things, but fundamentally, this is the order in which you have to behave. And you've got about 2 hours to get all of this underway, okay? And it's really 5 simple steps, right? The first step in crisis response is to stop the production of victims. Stop the production of victims. If you keep producing victims, things just get worse before they get better. The second step is managing the victim dimension. If you're the perpetrator or you're the person who has a primary responsibility, however it came about, when there are victims, you have a primary responsibility to take care of those people or get them into care and set up a process that takes care of them from the start. The longer you wait, the more the story becomes about them and not even about you, but it becomes about them. Third, and this is a crucial thought, communicate internally. I'm going to talk about this more in just a little bit, but internal communication is really important because we spend so much time focused on communicating outside that we leave all the people inside on the outside, so to speak. And the problem is that energizes everybody to speak. And sometimes they speak for a very benevolent reason. They know you're busy, your boss is busy, but all that sort of stuff. And so they'll tell you what they know. Well, what they know is what they heard from the person in the next cubicle, who doesn't know more than they do. Internal messaging is crucial from the start and throughout the entire early time of the crisis. And what you find is that it discourages people from talking. They just, once they know a little bit, they'll say less and maybe say nothing, or they'll follow your plan, which is to get to you or to get to the appropriate communication structure that you're going to put in place. And which leads essentially to the fourth step, which is to notify in the same fashion those indirectly affected, those who aren't in crisis mode because of you, but they got a problem because you have a problem. Okay. It's the same communication strategy as internal communications. Brief but frequent messages that bring people up to date on what's going with what you know. And finally, the fifth step is what I call manage it, the self-appointed and self-anointed, right? This is the new media, the old media, bloggers, guessers, people smarter than you, or that they think they are at any rate. Now, here's the point. This is what you have to get done in the first hour or two of your response. And failing to get this done is crucial because it's nagging behind you constantly, and these things tend to grow on their own behalf if we don't address them this quickly. And the analogy I use, the metaphor I've always used, is it's a military term in the U.S. military called the golden hour. And just after World War II, the major military services, and I'm sure in every country who was involved in that war, began to try, medical services wanted to figure out what was how can we reduce the dying in war? And in the U.S. experience, this was the Army Medical Corps. They determined that the single largest cause of death for soldiers was bleeding to death on the way to treatment in a rear area, bouncing on a Jeep or a truck somewhere through the woods and that sort of stuff. But about that same time, in 1945, 1946, a company in Connecticut invented a machine called the helicopter. You had no idea what they've invented, but they gave it to all of the U.S. military services to start with, a few machines, and said, play with this and figure out what to do with it, and then we'll sell you more, okay? Well, the folks in military medicine looked at this immediately, thought of it without the guns on the skids, but with litters to transport patients, and they solved one of the biggest single problems they had, which was essentially jerking these people, and of course, additional injury in resolution. When the Korean War started, there was one other innovation in American military medicine, which was, and this may have been done by other military medicine too, but I'm only familiar with the American experience. The medicine did one other thing. They took the surgeries out of the hospitals and put them at the battle line. So when you were wounded on the battlefield, you were picked up by a helicopter, taken a very short distance to a MASH, right? A military, it's really a mobile army surgical hospital, and everybody on the planet knows what a MASH is, right? And the data was astounding. If you arrived, no matter how injured you were, if you arrived alive at a MASH, the chances were 90% or better that you're going to leave alive from a MASH. So this is the metaphor I use in talking to executives about how you got to get these important things done, these 5 steps, and you've got a couple of hours to get them underway. One other point of this, move on. The biggest problem we face in crisis is, when do we talk? And we know so little, so long in these circumstances. We find that we have bosses huddling around in a room somewhere without us, trying to figure out what to say when we know so little. This strategy, these 5 steps, are your script about things to talk about, in the first instance. You got 144 characters or 280 characters, get out with right away, talking about what you're going to do, what your plan of response is. And it's substantive, it's concrete, it's important, and it's fast. The most common criticism of crisis response, especially communications, is, why did you wait so long to talk? And, Well, I can't say the bosses were huddling in the room somewhere because they didn't know what to do. They don't want to say that either. And that's the truth. The point is this: there is no credible, believable, really honest way to explain the silence in the beginning, even if it's just a half an hour or an hour. No, you have to be able to speak immediately. And today, thanks to the web and social media, we can and we must. Okay. So, and we do have a story to tell. This is it. So think about the power of this. And again, it reinforces that notion of readiness. What are they ready to do when this other tragedy tends to happen? Just remember these things, okay? I call these the truisms of crisis, right? Bad news always ripens badly, and you will one thing for sure, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And we actually have to talk this way to help people understand where we're going. There's no such thing as 20/20 hindsight because there's no such thing as 20/20 foresight. Silence is the most toxic, reputationally, unrecoverably damaging circumstance. And it's the one behavior that will always taint your response, no matter how perfect your response happens to be. There are always going to be bellyachers, bloviators, gripers, second guessers, actually most of them from the PR practice, your colleagues down the street. And they just happen. You never come out of these things with everybody happy. So let's think about it another way. We're gonna solve the problems and move forward with people when people are happy or not, and that's just the way it is. And I think the final thought that I always mention you want to think about is that, and this is really important, speed beats smart every time. What I'm telling you here is, one of the reasons the bosses go in a room is because they're all saying, okay, this happened. How can we take dramatic action today to make sure this never happens again? And the answer is, that's impossible. We don't even know everything what's going on. Don't even know how many victims there are. We don't know how it got caused. We know nothing. We have to find all that out. So the issue is to do things as promptly as you can. And these 5 steps are the things to do promptly while you're finding out what you can actually do, what you can actually resolve. There's this management attitude that, first of all, it'll never happen here. Secondly, it'll never happen to me because I'm too smart for that. And thirdly, that if it does happen, we can be on it and take care of it in no time. And the search for the smart solution is the thing that gets us into even worse shape, okay? Speed beats smart every time. My father used to say, Jim, when in doubt, do something, okay? And I added to that, from a crisis standpoint, when in doubt, do something and do it now, okay? There are going to be mistakes. In fact, if you look at resources spent for crisis response, you'll never spend more money more stupidly than you will, and purposelessly than you will in a crisis. But that's the name of the game. And the issue here is much less about expense, but about making progress incrementally to resolve the issues you face, and especially managing the issues facing victims. Let's go to the next slide if we can. I'm talking about victims because you really have to help management understand. They don't know this. This is something they do not learn in management school. Very few of us actually do. Victimization is, as you can see on the screen, self-designating, self-maintaining, self-terminating. And what this means essentially is that victims essentially designate themselves. So you say, well, whoa, wait a minute. So the guy's bleeding, he's paralyzed, he's not a victim. Well, the answer is he is a victim if he chooses to behave like a victim. Most people in most cultures, and I mentioned I've worked in many cultures, not every culture, but the inclination of most of us, whatever our backgrounds and situation is, when we get knocked down, our first instinct is to try and get up, get back to work, get the kids home from school, all these things that we have obligations to get done. And we're not worried about, and we'll get help somewhere along the way, okay? And if we can't get up, we'll get help, but still, that's what we're concerned about getting done. So, but what I'm talking about is the person who, on the way up, when they get to that first knee, they reach in their pocket, pull that device out that we all have, the phone, and think about what? Calling a lawyer, calling a help group, calling somebody, calling their mother, calling somebody to begin to figure out, how I'm going to resolve this issue myself against those who did this to me. That's what I'm talking about. It's generally a very small number. In most really revolutionary circumstances in our cultures, it doesn't take 100,000 people to make change happen as it can with 5 committed, resolute, victimized feeling individuals. That's who we're talking about here, okay? Victimization is self-designating. Most of us just want to get back to work and get things going again. It's self-maintaining, meaning that it's going to last as long as the victim feels they're being victimized. No legal practice, no legal effort, no managerial situation is going to shorten that function. That's determined by the victim themselves, which is why I say it's self-terminating. You don't always know when people have resolved the issues for themselves, except that they're not complaining anymore, they're maybe not suing anymore, that sort of thing. But self-designated, you have to think about this, because management is always asking, well, why are these people so angry? Why? What? It wasn't our fault. We wouldn't do this intentionally, which remains to be seen, by the way. But this is the pattern. Next slide, please. Victims suffer from, victimization is caused by, interestingly, a pattern of events. If you look at this slide, it's meant to illustrate, the thing about victimization is, it doesn't have to be just a bully hitting somebody on the head or some accident that occurs or some situation. The vast majority of victimization happens every single day through the behaviors of people around us, okay? Bullying is on the screen, you see it there. Bullying is actually, a lot of studies do this in many cultures, is about 6% violent, pushing, shoving, beating up people, that only about 6%. The rest of it is all verbal. And the reason I raise it here is because we have to really begin thinking about how language gets us into more trouble than blowing something up does. Okay, and these words are important because and we're the word people, we have to think about filtering these kinds of behaviors and language out of what we talk about and what the bosses talk about and what employees talk about, so we don't further victimize people who are already in trouble, for other reasons. So this is an aspect of victimization we don't really think of. And the story is this: our moms raised us generally with the kind of a notion that, look, sticks and stones will hurt your bones, but words will never hurt you. Okay, this is kind of an English fairy tale kind of thing. But by the time you're 5, it's a total lie, right? Because assume you survive the attack, your bones will heal and there'll be scars, but you'll move on with your life. But you will not heal from abusive behavior. You will not heal from bullying. You will not heal from dismissiveness, from fear, from lies, from sarcasm, from shame. These are bloodless, scarless wounds, okay, that no one can see. You can't even see them. But these go in. I mean, we're all adults in this conclave at the moment. We've all been through some of this, and some of us go through this every day in some circumstances. And these things never heal. And you're just as much a victim as someone who got hit by a car, or hit by a truck, or hit by some product that didn't work. The difference is, in those circumstances, you will heal for the most part. But there's much more to this kind of victimization that we think about going on in the world, and especially right now with the politics of the world and the politicization of so many issues and things. These come to the fore, and there's just tremendous ongoing victimization of people. And it's something to think about in this concept of victims. It isn't just someone who wound up being physically hurt and is bleeding, so you see they need assistance. Next slide, please. Studying victims for many years. I've been lots of studies of victims, victimization. And because this is so important for leaders and managers and supervisors to learn, I've tried to really simplify this to the most important aspects of this condition. Victims feel, among other things, these 4 powerful emotions: anger, dread, fear, rage, frustration, powerlessness, helplessness. I mean, think about the video interviews we see of people who are victims. What do they talk about? They talk about that, you know, someone did this to them. They couldn't avoid it. They couldn't stop it, right? Powerlessness, helplessness, inadequacy, walking but wounded, in agony, and alone. All victims. And I realize that I'm talking to an audience, all of whom have been victimized by something. So you can relate to what I'm talking about here, this feeling of being alone and helpless and misunderstood. And you feel, even it goes beyond that, we feel betrayed, okay? Trust no one, those sort of things. Because from our perspective as a victim, there is no one to trust. So this is a very important concept really to think about. And how it, next slide please, this is how it translates itself into the behavior of victims, okay? The 3 things that stand out in my mind are these 3 certain behaviors, okay, by victims. The first one is what I call intellectual deafness. And you know, if you've been through this, or you work with people who feel victimized, it's one of the most frustrating parts of dealing with people who are victims, and that is they don't seem to hear anything you say, right? One of the first, when we talk about putting up, say, a website with some answers to questions and things, the first question the boss asks is, just how long do we have to have this website up? They feel if you put it up once for a week or 2 or a day or 2, that's fine. My response always is, until no one is asking the questions any longer, until nobody cares, okay? But it's this fascinating, this circumstance where no matter how many times you tell somebody and how many ways you answer a question, it's on the web, it's in the mail, it's on social media, it's on the radio, and still they say, why aren't you doing anything about this problem? And this is so frustrating because we think we are. But the fact is, we are only going to communicate with them when they're ready to listen. We're going to talk about that, okay? When you're a victim, you have this monologue in your head all the time. Just your brain is talking to you against you. It's like it doesn't really belong to you. It's, how could you be so stupid? You should have known this would have happened. You pushed it as far as you could, and then you went a little bit further, and look at the mess you got yourself into. This is going on constantly. So this is part of the intellectual deafness. They can't hear other people because their brains are constantly after them to do something about the situation that they may have caused even for themselves, okay? And the third, this third behavior is everything is a question for a victim. Why me? Why now? Why this? Who picked me for this problem? Who's responsible? How do I find them? You know, how do I do something to them equivalent to what they've done with me? And this is, again, each of these 3 things is such a frustration for us as the perpetrators, so to speak, because, how many times do we have to repeat this thing? And the answer is until they walk away feeling satisfied. How long will all of this stuff go on? And the answer is as long as it takes for people to feel some resolution in their lives, which we're also going to talk about. And why do they keep asking the same questions that we have spent gazillions of revenue in broadcasting and printing and mailing and all this sort of stuff and meeting with people? And again, the answer is until things start resolving themselves from the victim's perspective and some of the answers come through. This is, and you say, well, Jim, about this time too, the clients are saying, Jim, this is completely irrational. And my response is, now you're getting it. Victimization is an irrational state, which is very unresponsive to rational approaches. And I'm telescoping a lot of research and a lot of thinking and a lot of experience here. But the fact is, this is the way victims are. And it's the company that has thought this through, the company that understands the dynamics of victims, the company that approaches it the way I'm talking about, recognizing that these people are in pain, they're suffering, and this is what they're suffering. And we're going to suffer right along with it until it gets resolved from their perspective on their timeline. Just something that's realistic. So when you're during your readiness, you want to have what I'm talking about now. You want to have a victims discussion. So management is not surprised, and even your fellow employees are not surprised that these things are happening, and are going to happen when people become victimized. Next slide, please. Here are the things that victims need. Again, I know this is quite an oversimplification, and in fact, if you care to, there is a document I can. In fact, I think it's included in your handout. It's a monograph I wrote that's 4,000 words long, but it's a monograph on this conversation we're having right now in much greater detail. And I urge you to read it and think it through and begin to think about the importance of this subject as a core part of your response strategy and thinking. Victims in general need 4 things. Validation, okay? And validation simply says to the victim, you're not, you didn't make this up. I do believe it happened to you. We're doing our best to resolve it. You have to trust us to get as much of the stuff done as we can. But victims feel, rightly so, that the first reaction of perpetrators is to blame them. Well, if you wouldn't have been there at 9:30 when you're not supposed to be there at 9:30, this wouldn't have happened to you. The excuse after excuse for why, you're the one who's responsible for the problems you're facing. Preferably the perpetrator, like us, if we're the perpetrators, we're the ones saying this. They want visibility. All victims want visibility. They have the desire to tell their story someplace. And the more you resist that, the more you interfere with that, which happens a lot, the more you essentially get in the way of this visibility desire. The more irritated, agitated, and chances are the more explosive their experience as a victim becomes. Help them be visible. Put them in front of a microphone. Get them in front of the meeting with important people so they can tell their story. Make it easy for them to tell their story. The more they tell their story, the less likely it's going to be, well, it will moderate their behavior to some degree, okay? They want to describe their pain and suffering, and they want to warn others about you. It's not going to be pleasant, but you're not a victim, they are. Just get it started, okay? Vindication, meaning, you see this so often. Some company makes a machine that malfunctions and injures a bunch of people. Okay, so the people are taken care of, they go to the hospital, whatever it happens to be, and then the company announces that they're going to revise and rebuild this machine because they had a plan to do this that goes back 10 years. Well, that's bull. But nonetheless, the one thing that the victims have is victory over something that's afflicting them. Let them have it. It's free. It's empathetic. It doesn't cost anything. Let them take credit. They're going to stand up and say, yeah, they took that machine out of that building because they knew it was killing people, blah, 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 right? So, these are only words that hurt no one, but help the victims, begin to resolve the circumstances they face, okay? This is a really interesting concept, okay? Next slide, please. This is the scary part. Victims want more than anything an apology. We've talked about this already. And you can see it, verbal or written admission of responsibility for hurting someone, a specific recognition and description of the damage caused, lessons learned, changes made to prevent situations from happening again. This is a profile of an apology right here. These 5 points are what I call the perfect apology. And if you're apologizing around these 5 points, or you leave one out, it's not a valid apology. Or we're in the if center right now. We're going through this entire thing. I see this globally. Well, if I hurt you, if I offended you, if I blah, 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 right? Well, that's not an apology. That's self-forgiveness. It's very obvious, and it's re-injuring the victims themselves. I said earlier, and I've written about it in the materials you have, an apology is the atomic energy of empathy. It is amazing. I mean, there's nothing more powerful you can do for a victim than apologize sincerely. These 5 points I'm talking about right here, to settle things down and make things easier for people. Next slide, please. I like to switch gears a little bit here and just kind of talk a bit about those things that truly matter about getting crisis readiness done. There, I said it myself. To getting our readiness perfected. And I generally try to subject readiness activity to there's 7 tests, all right? There's 4 on this slide, 3 on the next. But you can see, involve top management from the beginning. One of the great Achilles heels of crisis planning is we get together, by ourselves, and we start cooking up a crisis plan. And then someone said, well, we need the director of this division to at least to look at this, because we're going to start spending money pretty soon. And it's a problem. You really have to go to the person whose life and whose circumstance is going to change dramatically to get permission to do this before you start. You say, wow, geez, that's really scary. Well, it's scary, but it's the only way it actually works. If you fail to allow the boss, the person whose job is on the line when the bad things happen, not yours, has no say in this from the very beginning, it's hard. They're going to have everything to say before you even get started down the road. And the issue with this is as you start implementing your readiness approach, this is when you bring management in to be briefed on it before you start and get their advice. Before you start even doing specific planning for a scenario, bring them in, talk about the victim dimension, talk about the process you're going through and why you're going through it, okay? It's really not just to protect your reputation, it's to protect their position in the organization and essentially the ongoing relationship with the company with its various publics, okay? You have to involve top management from the beginning. And quite frankly, if they don't want to be, I mean, you can go ahead, but it's not going to work. They're still going to do the things they do as leaders and managers, and you're just going to have that much more difficulty. Bring them in, get them started, especially the most senior executives you can, people who can turn to their colleagues and their peers and say, hey, this is making a lot of sense. Let's just get with it here and quit what I call huddling. All this time they spend together making things up, stuff you've already thought through a dozen times, and we're not in the room kind of thing. Include management level response plans, okay? The people who run the place have special responsibilities during emergencies. One of the most important is setting the tone for your response. If the boss gets angry, and they often do, and makes uncalculated statements to start with, that empowers everybody else to behave the same way. So you have to have a management plan for these people to help them understand the concept, the implications of what they're doing. Build on pattern intuition means that in my experience, been doing this over 40 years, there is no such thing as a new crisis. The bad stuff has happened to somebody somewhere before it's happened to you. So when you're talking about crises and people want to know, how do you know this? The answer is, and I talk about the patterns of crisis and how they have happened elsewhere and how the responses have been bungled and all that sort of stuff, right? Establish this empathy-based approach throughout what you're talking about. It's very important. Next slide. You talk about this, move to readiness. Always talk about readiness. Even when they keep talking about crisis, you talk about readiness. Being ready, getting ready, making choices that are based on being ready. You know, avoid the decisions and behaviors that cause failure. We'll talk about those in just a minute. And, you know, overcoming common readiness deficiencies, which are the barriers put up by talking so much about crisis, in my judgment. Let's do this. Let's see. Let's move ahead if we can to slide 17, and then there's some questions I'm going to take time answering. And the questions I don't get to answer in this program, we'll find another way. You'll be told about another way I'm going to answer the questions. Okay. Slide 17. I'm looking for the slide that says here, hold on. Go to, try slide 18, try the next slide, okay. I just want to review this with you. Everything in crisis is a pattern. Failure is a pattern. And these 9 items on this list are the typical profile of crises that fail to respond appropriately, okay? And we've already talked about silence. Stalling is when they go into a room to talk and do nothing, and then they come out and deny everything, okay? These are, I talk about these with management. I walk them through scenarios, even in their own industries when I can, about where this has happened. And the thing you have to remember is this, and when it comes to silence, you know, there is no rational, reasonable explanation for appearing to do nothing for a period of time before you speak. You must begin speaking. We talked about that earlier. Same is true for stalling. There is no excuse for this. It taints your response, even if your response is textbook, okay? Denial is ridiculous. If it's leaking, foaming, stinking, burning, you're going to get blamed for it until the question can be answered somewhere down the road when nobody cares but you anymore. Victim confusion is this notion that, look, we're a good company. We do all kinds of things in the community. This hurts us as badly as it hurts you. Well, I don't think so. We have to avoid this notion of thinking that we're the victims. Corporations, large organizations, powerful people who cause victimization are never victims themselves. It just doesn't wash. And it sounds like it is. It's self-forgiveness. We need to just forecast this and work our way around making these things. There's so many stories here. I once worked with a client that was the thing for the CEO was Little League Baseball. So he actually, for the entire region of the United States, he bought jerseys and equipment for Little League teams in like 7 different states. And he had this accident in his company, and it was a very serious accident. And a number of people died, many were injured. And he's kept talking about Little League. And a mother finally stood up in one of the meetings he was at and said, "No, how many jerseys equal the death of my son?" Okay, this is how ridiculous victim confusion is. Testosterosis is simply fighting back, hitting back, instead of just getting with the flow of things and moving things forward. Arrogance is making decisions for people without their being involved. You have to let the victims in the door. You have to let your critics in the door and work things out with them rather than against them. If you've done this much stuff, the next step is logical. You look in the organization and see who actually did this thing. Search for the guilty. By now you realize you wasted a lot of time and you can't explain it competently. So now you have fear of exposure, and ultimately you have to give in, you have to explain things. And then you get this, what I call management by whining around. It's like the finger in your navel. And this is a woe is me story, right? I'm a good guy, we're a good company. You know, good companies have bad things happen to them, blah, 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 sort of thing. This is the pattern. And my bottom line on this particular circumstance is, the louder they whine, the more I know I'm going to find something, and they're going to find something that makes them even more responsible than they think they are. This is such a wonderful subject, such an interesting topic to talk about. You have the rest of my slides there. Many of them are self-explanatory, I think, and you have the handout material. We have some questions that have come in, and let me just take a few of them right now in the remaining minutes. This is from Tim. It says, you mentioned that speed beats smart every time. When do we talk? How fast should we be getting out there to communicate how fast is fast? Fast is now, N-O-W. As I said, we're in an environment now where you're only 140 characters away from avoiding that criticism of why didn't you talk? What did you know? When did you know it? Okay. Talk now. Practice now. I mean, part of this readiness process is teaching yourself how to do that in a variety of circumstances, okay? The price is simply too high when you're doing all this stuff and saying nothing. And I realize this is an attractive option to leadership because they don't like doing things without knowing things. But the more you delay, the less, frankly, your smart solution is going to have any impact. You're far better off to make a few mistakes going forward and repairing those and learning from them and actually helping other people be involved in the resolution of those than waiting to have the perfect solution, which actually never does come. Do it now, say it now, challenge it now, change it now. Okay, that's what I'm talking about, okay? This is a question from Marty. If you have someone who's annoyed and demonstrating intellectual deafness, would you then employ what the perceived understanding of empathy is and ask them to clarify their issue, then respond with something that is empathetic to their individual issue? This is a big question, but the real issue with empathy is if you're going to ask them questions, here's what I do. I use small numbers. Say, look, tell me if you can, what is the single most irritating thing you're experiencing at this moment? That's something they can put into words. What are the two things you believe we could do today to move this process forward and help your family and to help you move forward? Okay, ask questions productively, keep them uncomplicated, and then be ready to act on the things that you respond. Okay, empathy is something which you really have to practice and think about. We all go through these circumstances. Now's the time to begin thinking about handling the kinds of questions. I mean, we do this for the media, right? We prepare lists of questions to get ready. We need to prepare lists of questions the victims are going to ask and go forward. The last thing you can say to somebody that I think is most irritating is to say, if you have any questions, give me a call. Well, that's a bunch of crap. I mean, that's a cop-out, okay? You should know what the answers are. At the very least, you could even say, this is what we're hearing from other people in your circumstance. Okay, they seem to be mentioning these things. Okay, that's empathy. Okay, especially when you can say what you're doing about them, because empathy, remember, is deeds, not words. It's deeds. It's not PR. It's not even talking about them. It's doing things that speak louder than words. That's what empathy is. Okay. Think about it. Good question. From Delph, what would you advise leaders to say now in response to Black Lives Matter? I tell you, I think we're hopefully seeing some shift in the thinking about this. I hope we are. At this point in time, we're trying, people are talking, companies are talking, and doing things that they hope will help the circumstance, help this issue. And make some progress with the problems that we have with race in around the world. So my answer is do something, get started, find out what you're comfortable with, but get into it because the only we can tell it's going to be around for a while, and we don't really know the extent of how this is going to turn out. Do something that makes sense, and do it for the sake of doing it. As something, as I said before, that is empathetic, that we don't have to PR about. I mean, part of the problem is we got all these people, you know, we gave 100 million masks a day to some place, we say all this stuff, but no, the answer that it really doesn't help the victims who aren't getting any help, and it doesn't help the people who never get help when these things happen anyway. Do something for the folks who never get the help anyway. Last question from Marty. I agree the top management needs to be involved from the start. Do you have any tips on how to persuade otherwise resistant top management to become involved? So many are just so dismissive, focusing on budget rather than being proactive and in control if something happens. Well, the techniques I've talked about, the information I've talked about in a readiness structure says we're going to be talking about these things before something happens. The last time you want to start this stuff, well, you're going to have to, is when something has occurred, which so many companies do. But get started in talking about these ideas and these concepts early on, especially the advice of getting the top person in sync with stuff. And the way you do that is to essentially ask them, you know, what is the thing they fear most? What is the thing that keeps them awake at night? And start with that, even if you don't think it's anywhere near relevant to what's going on in the world. And maybe it involves something in business which you don't understand, because so many of us aren't good at math, so to speak. But get good at math, but on top of that, you know, start where they are. Always start where they are. The biggest problem we have as communicators, among the many, is that we're always starting with communication. And I have to say, you know, if communication is all you have, that's why they're not calling you. You got to talk about things that matter to them from their perspective first. All right. Thank you so much. So much to talk about. It's a great subject. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Jim. I personally could listen to you all day. I'm sorry, but we are almost out of time, so I do need to do the wrap up now. I love your Chicken Little metaphor. I'm actually going to use that. I will credit you though. As an internal communication practitioner though, I'm really pleased to hear you say that internal communication is a critical component of the planning strategy and the response strategy. And your point about showing empathy, I think is a very important one, and of course, very timely one right now. I wanted to say thank you to everybody for attending today's webinar. I do apologise to those people who joined late, and that is probably my fault because it is my fault because there was a glitch with the Zoom details. So I do apologise for that, but you will get everything that Jim spoke about today, the recording, the handouts, and a copy of the slides, and we'll send that to you sometime later today. I just wanted to let you know that our next Lifting the Lid webinar will be held on Wednesday, the 8th of July at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and that is with Gabrielle Dolan. She's a best-selling author, educator, and business storytelling expert. We're going to be having a heart-to-heart chat about real communication and authentic leadership, what it means, what it looks like, and how we can all do it better. Please get in touch if you have any feedback about today or any further questions for Jim. I know we have run out of time. I do appreciate you coming along today. It is our first one, and as with all firsts, there are some teething problems, but I would love to hear your thoughts. And on that note, thank you once again and stay safe and well. Bye for now. Thanks again, Jim.
You bet. Take care now.